Yes, the participants are in and the interpreters are ready. So it's okay to start the webinar. Thanks, Cecilia.
Hello, Cecilia. The participants are already in. We can already start. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I would like to mention that there are simultaneous interpretation available in French, Arabic, and Spanish. First, if you need it, please, you can use. My name is Cecilia Mondolo. I am Technical Coordinator for Vice Chair Office from SAI Argentina, and I have the pleasure of moderating this section of the session of this webinar. First of all, and on behalf of our SAI, we would like to congratulate IDI and WGPD Chair for this initiative. We also like to extend to you all warm greetings from Vice Chair Dr. Francisco Javier Fernandez, to whom we are grateful for the opportunity to share our work with you today. To start with presentations and further debate, I'd like to remember the 4 key objectives in these sessions. If you can put them on the screen, please, Teresa. To provide an introduction, this is the first one, to provide an introduction and better appreciation of public debt sustainability and the roles of our size. The second one is to determine the tools or parameters used in assessing debt sustainability and the importance of having a sound model for fiscal policy approach and long-term fiscal solvency. The third, to understand the strategies and practices in managing public debt in order to reduce or adequate borrowing or to sustainability levels in our countries. Also, we can discuss innovation and lessons learned. And the fourth, finally, to learn from best practices of size in the matter. Before we start, I'd like kindly welcome and invite to share a few words with us to Mrs. Archana Shirsat, Deputy Director General of IDI. Archana, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and warm greetings to all of you from the Intersite Development Initiative. I'm indeed very pleased and delighted to welcome each of you to this webinar. I think the topic of this webinar is very timely and it's extremely significant given the conditions that the world is facing today. For a long time now, the Intosai community has recognized the significance of issues related to public debt and how these issues affect or are linked to every aspect of national development. In this regard, IDI and the working group, Intosai's working group on public debt, has a long-standing cooperation. We have over the years, and I remember since I joined IDI first time in the 2005, we have had long cooperation where we supported SAIs at a regional level. We have supported SAIs at a global and a trans-regional level as well. And the last initiative we did in this regard was ALBF, or the Auditing, Lending and Borrowing Frameworks Initiative, which was a trans-regional one. We also have, in cooperation with WGPD, made available a global public good, which is a handbook on public debt management, where we have worked together with this working group of experts. So when the working group came to us and said that they have picked up a lot of interest and need in the area of public debt sustainability, then we were happy to engage with that. This for us is just the beginning of our exploration of this issue. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the different viewpoints uh, and different perspectives on this issue, which we have started exploring. The way I understand it is that debt sustainability, which is the ability of the government to meet its current and future debt payment obligations, is very, very critical. If this does not happen, it can undermine economic growth. To put it very simplistically, I know that it's very complex, but it can really undermine economic growth and affect all of development. In IDI, we have been doing a lot of work with the Sustainable Development Goals. And when I was looking at Sustainable Development Goals, also looking at the financing for development, you would see that in SDG target 17.4, there is a specific target about assisting developing countries in attaining long-term debt sustainability through coordinated policies aimed at fostering debt financing, debt relief, and debt restructuring as appropriate, and address the external debt of highly indebted poor countries to reduce debt distress. So the goal 17.4 of the SDGs framework also talks to public debt sustainability. We think that SAIs have a very critical role to play, and this role, definitely they have an oversight role, but very often when we have seen this in the context of SDGs, we have seen that many times SAIs, when they raise issues, they can also, in a way, nudge their governments into action. So SAIs have more than an oversight role to play many times. They bring transparency, they bring awareness to the issue at a national level, at an international level, which is also a role that they play. Um, and it is important that when they are playing this role, that we are there as IDI and as WGPD to both support them in the development of their capacities that are necessary to do this, but also to promote the work that they have done. Because we don't want SAIs to be engaging in audits and then those audits don't have an impact on the government of the day. But this kind of discourse is such that it is not something that SAIs alone can look at. You need this whole community or an ecosystem of key actors who work in collaboration, both when you look at debt sustainability as a subject matter, but also when you look at the audit of debt sustainability. So I'm really hoping that we will also discuss and think about how we can work together more, how we can improve the collaboration between the different actors at the national level, regional level, potentially international level. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we will have now. I would like to thank all the speakers and our colleagues, especially from the WGPD, who are cooperating with us on this. And I'm looking forward once again to this webinar. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archana, for your kind words. Well, now is the part 2 of this panel discussions, and we will hear about the stakeholders' insights. To begin our panel discussion, I will ask to show on screen the first set of questions that will guide our experts in sharing their insights. As you can see, we have 2 questions. The first one is what is the current global landscape related to public debt and its sustainability risks? And the second one is what is debt sustainability and the debt sustainability framework and how does it work? The first panelist is Mrs. Daniela Margalais Prates, Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the Division of Globalization and Development Strategies of UNTACT. Welcome, Daniela. The floor is yours.
Hi,
Yes,
Hello.
we can see and we
Hi.
can hear you.
Are you listening?
Yes, yes. Please, Daniela.
Hi, are you listening?
Daniela, we can hear you.
Ah,
Please
you are
go
here.
ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you. 1 minute, I will not only close here then. Sorry, the door was open. Then thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to participate in Intonside events. Then I will, in this section, in my presentation, I will address debt vulnerabilities in developing countries, but I will focus on the external debt vulnerabilities and amid a challenging global outlook. Then you can change. Then first, only to sum up the current developing countries challenges, please. Then, since I think the COVID pandemic, we are talking about how developing countries are facing intertwined challenges. Because after the pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, mounting geopolitical conflicts, tensions, and that we call cascading crisis. What happened? This reversed progress on the achievement of the SDGs. Then we are now, last year, we are at midway point, but is the last data we have, only 15 of the SDG were due to be met. And the situation now is even more challenging. So in the current context of major policy shifts and escalating geopolitical tensions, achieve sustainable development with external and I would say public debt sustainability is even more challenging. Because in this context, what are already happening? These contexts are undermining the multilateral trade system, tightening global financial conditions, and straining official development assistance. So what will happen? Exports and government revenues that developing countries needed to service their external public debt will decrease and the borrowing costs will increase. Thank you. You can change the slide. Then only to next one, please. Only to show we have an estimate of the 2024 for the stock of the external debt stocks. We also have the estimation for the external vulnerability indicators, because as you know, the World Bank data is up to 2023, and every year we make these estimations for a report on external debt sustainability and development that is a report of the UN Secretary General for the General Assembly that UNCTAD is oversee, and then we update. Then according to I will present our estimations. According to our estimations, the total external debt stock of developing countries achieved 11 billion, like 11.88 billion. This for all developing countries. That then the increase compared to 2023 were not substantive, no? Because 2023 we have really a small increase, and we can see that so 2.6%, and we can see that indeed we have a trend. If you see the annual change, this trend, we have we could say a stagnation. Even if we look after the COVID pandemic, we don't see really increasing trend in the total debt stock. And why this is happening, as I show in the indicators, because developing countries are facing increasing cost for servicing the debt. So you get even more in debt in this context is really like will complicate even more the external debt sustainability, public debt sustainability situation. What will happen also is an increasing in the share of the public and publicly guaranteed debt compared to the private non-guaranteed debt. Next slide, please. Then let's look to the external solvency indicator. So I will present here the indicator of external debt service to exports that related to the external debt sustainability of the country, including public and private guaranteed debt. And then this and showing also excluding China, because we see a big difference in some indicators. So we see that for all developing countries, this is the weighted average. This indicator decreased in 2024 for all developing countries, and developing countries excluding China, that is higher. And why this happened? Because the increase in the debt service was small, and exports increased. Last year, as now the World Economic Outlook published the data for 2024, the global trade volume was increase more than 3%. So it was really a very good performance that benefited developing countries, and also some commodities, the price of some commodities also increased. And then the external debt service, the increase was very small, but if we consider this weighted average, but we will see that there's a big divergence across developing countries, regions, and income groups. And also would like to remember two important debt burden thresholds. The thresholds of the London Agreement, that was an agreement on the German debt after the Second World War, that was that this indicator shouldn't surpass 5%, because this will endanger the German, Western German recovery. But we can also use the leak DSF that is between 10 and 20%, depending on the debt carrying capacity. Next, please. Then when we look to the what we call the public sector external solvency, so it's the capacity to pay through government revenues, the PPG debt service, we see an increase in 2024 compared to 2023, both with China and excluding China. And then we see that the PPG external service increased 25%. And the government revenue only 4%. So in this context, developing country sovereigns are doing everything that is possible to not get more debt, not increase the indebtedness, what is resulting in this stagnation of the total debt stocks. But next, please. But now we'll see the huge divergence across developing countries. So first, when we look at the developing countries regions, again, external debt service to export revenues, the divergence is greater. We see that South Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean still have the higher levels, but two regions record annual increase compared to 2023, that South Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East and North Africa. And why? Because that service outgrew exports. And we see that the situation is worse for Sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. When we look at the PPG debt service to government revenues, this indicator climbed up in all regions, but Europe and Central Asia. Why? The PPG debt service outgrew government revenues, and as this was almost widespread, this reflected in the weighted average for developing countries that I showed, and we see that the increase for Sub-Saharan Africa was much, much, much greater, achieving more than 18%. So more than 18% of this region government revenues are being spending in savings, the external debt. This means that the debt savings, PPG debt savings, are crowding out expenditure in development and sustainable development. Next, please. We also calculate the the indicators for incoming groups. Here we are considering only developing countries according to the UN classification, and then we classify then according to the World Bank incoming groups. And in this case, we also see divergence. In this case, for 3 country groups, the indicator increased, so high income, lower middle, and low income groups. So only for upper middle income didn't increase, but as for the as we saw for also the regions, the Sub-Saharan Africa, greater increase. Here we see for low-income countries. And this is not a coincidence because many lower-income countries are in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. And for the PPG that serves to govern revenues, this indicator increased for all income groups, but also the low income is the more vulnerable. For this group, the debt service, PPG debt service increased 95% compared to 5% in government revenues. Then we can imagine what will happen with, even if we had now a pause on the US-China trade war and like stabilization in global financial markets, the environment is still uncertain. Anyway, we will live in a world of higher tariffs that will affect both export revenues and government revenues of developing countries. And then, next, please. Then only to finalize, I only would like to share with you the policy recommendations, which policy recommendations we are now working on. In our view, what is needed to address? So developing countries to achieve sustainable development with external debt, public debt sustainability, they need new financing with lower cost, more new long-term financing. So we need long-term and affordable new long-term financing, but we also need to reduce the servicing costs of the existing debt, and for countries that are at the brink of debt distress or on debt distress, reduce the levels of existing debt. And then to achieve these outcomes, I outline here a set of required actions. So for lower cost of new finance, we have many actions that would contribute to that. Increase grant finance. What we are seeing is exactly the contrary on that. We started to develop this in January, and the prospects for achieving these outcomes are really not good. But to achieve this outcome would be important an increase in grant financing, concessional finance, a reduction in the cost of non-concessional finance, lower the risk premium that developing countries pay in the global financial markets, reduce the risks for the debt countries, extend the maturity of new lending, and scaling up innovative financial instruments. For increase the quantity of new long-term finance, also, and again, increase grant financing, concessional financing, non-concessional financing, and scaling private finance. To reduce the cost of existing debt, reprofiling and reschedule debt, and also the costs of non-concessional IMF lending lines could be reduced. For example, a further reduction of surcharges and charges. And to reduce the levels of existing debt, we need debt restructure and debt relief. But currently, the most important framework for that, the common framework for this mechanism, only PRGT or IDA eligible countries that has access to this mechanism, and many developing countries that are non-eligible are also facing great debt challenges. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for your interesting input on developing countries. I'm sure that participants will use this data in their everyday work. Now we will continue with our next panelist, and please me join in welcoming Mr. Jafar Al-Rikabi, Senior Country Economist for the Philippines at the Economic Policy Global Practice of the World Bank. Welcome, Jafar. The floor is yours, and I remember that you have only 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Jafar. Please go ahead.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to IDI and WGPD. Thank you, Cecilia, for your introduction, for hosting me. In this presentation, I want to do three things. At least one of them, if not two, has been made much easier by Daniela's presentation. So I'll try to maybe take up even less than 15 minutes time to avoid the audience hearing the same thing more than once. Let me begin with why, with a sort of high-level picture on the global public debt situation. Of course, debt is often in the news. The question is why, and to what extent should we pay attention? We hear about Eurozone sovereign debt crises. We hear about sovereign debt crises in Africa. We hear about sovereign debt crises in South Asia. We hear about fiscal pressures worldwide. The question is this just sensationalist news, or is this reflecting reality? And the first key message I want to leave you with is debt is often the news because actually sovereign defaults occur far too regularly than we would like. If you just take a very simplistic timeline from the 1980s to 2020s, you see that we have quite a few countries, including large middle-income countries, that have had sovereign defaults. In Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, we see this time and time again. You might observe that some of these countries are the same countries. So somehow they get stuck in some kind of cycle of sovereign pressure, sovereign debt pressures. Question is, how can we resolve these things? The basic key message here is that that I think Daniela already summarized it, is that the current debt context that we find ourselves in today is really rather challenging. We have high fiscal deficits persisting, driven by low revenues in low-income countries. We have high debt service costs, as we've learned, due to high interest rates and large amortization. We see an increasing reliance on domestic debt financing, and that has its benefits, but it also has its vulnerabilities. And typically this is typically involving shorter maturities and higher interest rates. And we see liquidity pressures exacerbated by falling net financing after amortization from private and official bilateral creditors. Now, I want to summarize, the situation that we're in. I think the left-hand side is another way of depicting a message that that my colleague from UNCTAD was describing. Maybe the right-hand side introduces another dimension to the story that I want to emphasize, that I didn't hear as much in her story, which is that we think that limited progress in domestic revenue mobilization is a key challenge and driver of why we continue to face persistent deficits, we continue to face debt accumulation challenges. And one way of seeing that is this chart on the left. We've grouped countries similarly by income classification: low income country, LIC, low middle income country, upper middle income country, and high income. And we show the median fiscal balances over a number of years. And you can see that compared to 2001, if you look at the median years from 2011 to 2020, if you look at 2021 to 2024, you see that particularly for low income, low middle income, median fiscal balances have deteriorated. Now, at the same time, with the chart on the right and the link with tax revenue, is that countries continue to struggle to meet the minimum tax to GDP threshold of 15% that the IMF and World Bank have identified as typically providing you with enough domestic revenue financing for your public spending needs and a cushion fiscal buffer, if you like, for times of crisis, right? So if you were to look, this is the number of countries in 2024 with a tax to GDP ratio lower than 15%. If you compared 2024 is all I'm showing you today, but if you looked at the chart 20 years ago, 2004, unfortunately, it would look very, very similar to this one. So we're seeing that countries are constantly struggling to raise higher domestic revenue. Another slice of the challenge, which I think we've heard already, so I can be brief, is that public debt was already rising prior to COVID-19 crisis. So in theoretically good times, where, you know, the economic textbook says you should be rebuilding your fiscal buffers, you should be lowering your public debt, we had accumulation and rising public debts across low middle income economies and developing economies. In fact, generally countries worldwide, including high income ones. And so really that meant that when you had a major crisis such as COVID-19, the fiscal room to maneuver was very limited. And so public debts jumped up even higher. Now, we've heard about some of the large gross financing needs. I'm presenting here to you IDI countries. These are low-income countries that are members of the International Development Association, IDI, an arm of the World Bank. And you can see that the gross financing needs chart on the left for IDI countries is really rather substantial and has grown up, jumped significantly, of course, since COVID-19. And then if you look at the top 10 IDI countries with the highest gross financing needs, not only do you see that these needs are quite substantial, but also you can, just by reading the names of countries, you can see a common theme, which is that countries that typically smaller, facing large natural disasters, increased risk of natural disasters, and countries that have had a lot of recent conflict, these are countries that are very susceptible to these type of pressures, right? So we need to understand, in other words, the point I'm trying to relay is we need to understand some of the underlying challenges that mean we continuously find ourselves facing debt and deficit pressures. The World Bank and IMF, we classify countries, particularly low-income DSF countries, in terms of their debt distress. And the challenge that we see is that already today, 14% of low-income countries are in debt distress. So this problem of debt that we're discussing today, this is not theoretical. Countries are undergoing it as we speak. And another 39% are at high risk of debt distress. If you look at countries in the reverse, low, I've circled here in green, that face low debt distress, there are only a very small share of low-income countries, and it's a share that has been generally declining over the last decade or so. So these debt vulnerabilities, this is not just a low-income story. It's also a story that faces middle-income countries. And here I show you, for instance, the challenges with high-growth financing needs that countries like Egypt, Pakistan are facing. These are large middle-income economies, and the percentage of public and publicly guaranteed external debt services is really rather substantial. So why do we care? We care because there are significant consequences when you get in trouble, right? There's a sharp deterioration in living standards and social tensions that we see when countries are forced to take very sharp fiscal adjustments, exchange rate evaluations, consumption typically we see collapsing. These things matter, and they hit the poor hardest, so they hit the most vulnerable hardest. And so we typically see that there are permanent effects on human capital. You get a lot of scarring in the labor market, for example, with young people unable to find jobs for multiple years. They get de-skilled, then it's very hard for them to re-enter or enter for the first time the job market once the economy recovers. So you see a drag on human capital. You see political systems facing and social life facing severe stress. The other reason why we care to avoid these kind of debt distress extreme situations is because they're typically not isolated incidents. They have spillovers, right? They can make it more likely that countries in your region also face fiscal pressures, but they have other types of spillovers. You can create immigration crises, you can create other type of crises, you can see economic spillovers through financial and trade channels. And so this becomes much bigger than just the country suffering from the crisis. Now, very briefly, since this is a webinar that trying to also upskill maybe some members of the audience who are less familiar with some of the terminology. It's not a full course on debt sustainability. I just want to highlight a few words that are useful to know. And then I want to give one last example of how we can address some of these debt sustainability challenges through structural reforms. So it's useful to think about debt sustainability not as a, are you debt sustainable versus are you not debt sustainable in a very kind of analog fashion, but rather think of it as a continuum. And concepts like solvency, liquidity, no unrealistic adjustment, these are concepts that we use in our critical, right? So solvency, that refers to the government's ability to service the debt in the short, medium, and long run without renegotiating or defaulting. If you like, that's your bare minimum. Your liquidity is giving us a sense on the level and composition of debt, whether it's consistent with an acceptable role of the risk. And this idea of a no unrealistic adjustment. Think of the crises that have happened in your countries or neighbors, regions. We often want to avoid a situation where the government has to take very dramatic policy adjustments that are implausible from an economic or political standpoint. So the government's debt situation, fiscal situation needs to be such that it doesn't land itself in this position, but rather can take more moderate reforms over the medium term. Another useful term to understand is that financing arrangements vary. My colleague talked about concessional financing, non-concessional financing. If that's not familiar for some of the members of the audience, I just want to clarify. Concessional financing refers to financing that offers below market interest rates, typically longer maturities, and it's offered by IFIs such as the World Bank, regional banks, Asian Development Bank, and other similar regional banks. Non-concessional financing, of course, is provided at market rates, typically by the private lender. Now, very last, I promise, geeky, basic textbook idea, again, just useful for the audience, is to understand some of the mathematics that goes into debt to GDP dynamics. I'm not actually going to talk about this equation, but what I want to say is that there are some factors that are useful to keep in mind. And that is that in the denominator, we were thinking about the contribution of real GDP growth. We're thinking about, on the other hand, monetary policy issues and exchange rate policy issues that impact on the effective real interest rates as well as on the exchange rate. And of course, the core of this is to understand how do we balance better primary balances. So these are some of the key aspects that go into the debt to GDP dynamics, and they come together in this type of relationship in a debt sustainability analysis, where we want to look at and project a country's GDP growth We'd want to understand its fiscal accounts, its revenue, its expenditure. Of course, those two come together to give us the fiscal balance. We need to understand its borrowing needs, and to what extent these borrowing needs can be met by domestic versus external borrowing. And these, of course, are, as I mentioned, influenced by your monetary and exchange rate policy. They feed into your balance of payments. And the rest of the world, of course, matters, because that can have impacts on both the balance of payments as well as on GDP. Shocks such as those recently we saw with global policy uncertainty around trade, these things can have a significant strain on countries through these types of challenges. So last thing I want to leave you with is just some ideas of what kind of structural reforms, fiscal reforms can actually help support debt sustainability. My colleague talked about various ways that you try to do debt management, or you try to lower the cost of servicing the debt. I want to take a step even further and say, okay, what kind of fiscal reforms does the government need to take? And maybe some of the participants here today can help build a case for that in their own country. And I just take one example, which is subsidy reform. Why subsidies? Because in a forthcoming World Bank report that looks at subsidy expenditure globally, we find that in the typical EMDE, emerging market developing economy, the median country will spend more on subsidies than it does on education and health combined. So this is a significant portion of expenditure. And when we talk about subsidies, by the way, here, we're talking about both tax and expenditure subsidies, meaning tax expenditures, tax incentives that erode the revenue base is a form of subsidizing firms and households, as is direct transfers using the budget. And here I've done a simulation for you just to show you how this is important, right? Which is that if you took in 2019, the 15 EMDEs with primary balances below the debt stabilizing level. So these are countries that are facing significant pressures. And if you took not only those countries that face those pressures, but also those countries that had direct transfers to firms or tax expenditures above the median in the sample of EMDE's subsidy database, you would find that 2/3 of the targets you need of savings to achieve debt stabilizing primary balances, 2/3 could be achieved simply by reducing the subsidy expenditure from above the median to the median EMDE level. I don't know if that was clear. So we're just saying not you're going to slash your subsidy expenditure to zero or something dramatic. We're saying if you're spending above the median for developing economies, just move to the median level, and those savings, they would be enough to put your primary balances in the green and help you significantly, therefore meet debt sustainability issues, right? Now, this simulation, the last slide, I will end here. This simulation is not just a theory. It actually happens in practice. And this is what this chart is trying to tell you, which is historically that for countries undergoing fiscal consolidation, they have successfully been able to rationalize subsidies, and that share of rationalizing subsidies, the savings generated has been much higher than if you took it as a share of the subsidies prior to reform as a share of their expenditure. So their weight of subsidies and fiscal consolidation, to simplify this chart on the left, the weight is much higher than the weight is in their total budget, which is to say it is feasible then to reform subsidies. And the final message, which links to this idea of do things gradually. This is the experience. Have a medium-term fiscal framework that is credible and does gradual reform. The chart on the right helps to show that for the smaller sample of countries that persist with a gradual subsidy reform. So this is N5, means 5 years of consequent years of doing the subsidy reform, versus N1, which is a sample 256 countries, just do it for 1 year. The type of savings you generate, the size is significantly higher. You can see up to 4.5 percentage points of GDP can be saved by those countries that do it gradually and consistently over a number of years. And so that's another message, that governments that are able to design credible fiscal consolidation programs, including in this case, a simulation around subsidy reform. There are countries that are able to generate a lot of savings and use that to stabilize their debt. With that, I want to say thank you very much. Very happy to answer any questions or address any comments from the floor. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you. Thank you, Jafar, for your presentation on the development of public debt. Your insight on the last quarter of the century, especially during the pandemic, is very interesting for us, for our size and for our auditors to take informed actions on this. And now, if you allow me, we move to the second set of questions, focusing on how countries have applied the results of debt sustainability analysis and the strategies adopted to ensure some public debt management. If you can show the questions on the screen, please. Yes, the first question is, how have the countries which the partner stakeholders evaluated, applied the results on the debt sustainability analysis conducted? And what fiscal policy reforms and debt strategies have been introduced as a result? And the second one is, what constitutes a sound debt sustainability analysis, and what common practices and strategies have been adopted by countries to ensure that sustainability of public debt? Now, I'm pleased to introduce for the first part to Mrs. Sally Torbert, Policy Manager at the International Budget Partnership. Sally, whenever you are ready, you have the floor, and remember, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and a very big thanks to IDI and the InterSci Working Group on Public Debt for inviting the International Budget Partnership, or IBP, to be part of this conversation. So if you don't know about IBP, we are a civil society organization that collaborates globally with many different society groups in many countries, and along with governments and oversight actors, including parliaments and audit institutions, to ensure that public finances and public budgets reflect the needs and the will of all people. And we increasingly pay attention to public debt issues and public debt accountability issues because of the fact that too often they are removed from many accountability systems and public oversight. And as a result, we particularly flag that creates an issue for debt sustainability, because you really need robust oversight, both from audit institutions and parliaments, but also from the public, to ensure that governments are held to account for making sound and sustainable decisions about borrowing and public debt management. So today I'll speak specifically around public debt sustainability analyses, but more generally around what we hope to see in terms of robust accountability systems around debt sustainability through government public resource management systems. So we would flag that in some of the research that the International Budget Partnership has done, that debt sustainability analyses, or DSAs, they are a critical part of a functioning accountability system, but they really are one small part of an overall system that needs to work. And you heard earlier about, for example, the InterSci Handbook on public debt management. So those systems are really the foundation upon which analyses of debt sustainability should be taking place. But that means that, in particular, when we look at debt sustainability analyses, too often they are seen as, or produced as, standalone technical documents. And in many cases, they are done by international institutions, for example, the World Bank or regional development banks, as part of the lending process. And that means they may not necessarily be integrated into domestic oversight systems. As highly technical documents, they often tend to be discussed only in narrow technical circles of experts, rather than being presented in accessible forms that support broader institutional scrutiny. And so we would argue that these types of analyses or assessments of debt sustainability should be incorporated into other key strategy and fiscal documents. And here I'm talking about national debt strategies, medium-term fiscal frameworks, and generally within the annual budgeting process that sets other aspects of fiscal policy, such as revenue targets and expenditure levels. But too many countries, we see this is not the case. So for example, every 2 years, IBP conducts a survey called the Open Budget Survey, which does an independent assessment of open budgeting practices. And in the most recent round, the Open Budget Survey 2025, we found that only 11% of the 125 countries that we looked at actually include a projection of fiscal sustainability as part of the proposed budget for a period that covers at least 10 years. So what that means, in essence, is that most governments are making annual decisions about the budget without considering the long-term fiscal sustainability of the decisions they are making that year. So this is an area where we say, okay, there's a disconnect between very technical analyses that are being done through debt sustainability assessments, but they may not be systematically informing national fiscal decision-making. And that is a big risk, right? What happens when that isn't taken into account is you do have higher risks of debt default or debt distress. And that has tangible consequences, as you heard Jafar say earlier in his presentation. We see during fiscal crises, you've got cuts to essential services, reduced investment and development priorities, and of course, disproportionate impacts on the people who rely on public services the most, especially marginalized communities and women. So here are a few examples of countries where we've seen DSAs being more meaningfully incorporated into national conversations and debates about public debt. So in Kenya, we would flag that there has been very high public attention to issues of public debt recently. But in particular, the Office of the Auditor General has used findings from DSAs to flag rising debt vulnerabilities and to audit specific public investments. And that findings from these audits have been presented to Parliament, that have contributed to hearings that scrutinized particular borrowing decisions, and that have led to calls for enhanced disclosure of contingent liabilities, especially borrowing by state-owned enterprises. And furthermore, Parliament has also incorporated findings from debt sustainability analyses in discussions around medium-term debt management strategies, and have also discussed it alongside their annual budget policy statement, producing recommendations on what should be target levels of debt service cost and the fiscal deficit. So here you see a much more integrated discussion of debt sustainability issues throughout the budget cycle. And importantly, these types of discussions have been picked up by civil society organizations such as the Okoye Uchumi Coalition, which have been playing a key role in linking debt issues to fiscal sustainability and reframing debt as a social and equity concern that all people should care about, and that help bring these issues into public and parliamentary debate. Similarly, we would flag the example of Ghana, where public pressure, in part that has been informed by civil society analysis of DSAs that have been produced, have actually contributed to restructuring of the country's debt strategy. And the government since has actually introduced a number of fiscal policy reforms that have built on those lessons, including trying to improve domestic resource mobilization and the efficiency of public spending. So the key lesson we would flag from these examples is that when DSAs are made public and accessible and robustly discussed by a number of oversight actors, not just audit offices, which we would include in discussions with you today, but also with parliaments and especially with the broader public and civil society, that can catalyze reform. But when DSAs are too opaque, too technical, then they're really not used in these ways that they could be. So what would we call for in particular around DSAs? We say that they should be transparent, realistic, and then responsive to domestic systems. So when we say transparent, that means disclosing the assumptions, methodologies, and the data that are used in producing the DSAs, and that they're made accessible to the broader public. And so we can give an example in Cameroon that has actually made a lot of progress in producing documents that are not just in English, not just for technical audiences, but produced in the national language. And they also produce simplified citizen-facing debt strategy documents that actually include lessons from DSAs and that explain it to the broader public, what these debt sustainability analyses tell us about long-term implications for fiscal policy. Realism is also essential. There's been a research done by the Finance for Development Lab that shows that DSAs often include systematic optimism. So that means, for example, underestimating deficits or overestimating GDP growth. So we would hope that, for example, audit institutions could potentially look at our DSAs that are produced. Are they realistic? Did they actually hold up over time? And then, as I said, responsiveness. We hope that there could be some look at whether or not DSAs and the findings from debt sustainability analyses are being included and discussed by other domestic actors, including in terms of being incorporated into medium-term frameworks and into annual budget processes and used by Parliament to make very responsible decisions about debt. And here are some other ways that we would include reform to strengthen accountability around debt sustainability. So, for example, some governments are legislating the use of DSAs. For example, Uganda requires that updated debt sustainability analyses are shared with Parliament annually. So that creates a regular mechanism for legislative scrutiny. Again, I mentioned that publishing simplified public-facing DSAs and briefings. And another way that we could encourage is that it should not just be only a small subset of international actors who do debt sustainability analysis. We would encourage, for example, joint or replicated debt sustainability analyses that other independent institutions, such as audit institutions or research institutes, replicate the methodology and double check the approach to say, are these realistic? And that will actually help increase the legitimacy and the uptake and use of debt sustainability analyses in national discussions. So thanks so much for your time, and back over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Sally. You are very interesting as always, especially on the CI and the initiative approach that you present will help us to have another insights for our analysis for transparency and accountability on our countries, especially on our size. Now, we have 5 minutes per speaker to round up or to say something if they want. The floor are yours, beginning with the representative of World Bank. Jafar, do you have some words to share with us?
I'm happy to answer any questions if there were. I didn't see any questions in the chat. Otherwise, I want to say I fully agree with what Sally shared. It's important to think of fiscal adjustment and debt sustainability analysis as part of a much bigger policy reform. And as we all know, if you want this policy reform to be sustained, if you want it to generate the type of support that governments sort of seek, you have to involve society. You have to involve society, civil society actors, academics. Some countries set up independent fiscal councils and bodies to play a role. At the same time, just to add a bit of controversy, I want to say that some of the maybe process of making the sausage maybe needs to be behind closed doors, right? And the reason for that is debt sustainability analysis, the tool, the model needs to be integrated with other frameworks. These include medium-term revenue strategies. These include medium-term expenditure frameworks. Now, some of these things, again, need to have a public and disclosed face, but some of these things are underpinned by, for example, microsimulation models using tax administrative filing data, right? It's not realistic or even desirable to expect the government to publish tax records, right? Data on its tax records. So we have to understand that some of the technical work that goes behind the scenes, for example, when you estimate the revenue impact of reforms, some of that can be made public, it should be made public. Some of it needs to be behind maybe more closed doors. So I think we fully support transparency, we fully support explaining to the public, but we also think it's important to build capacity and the level of comfort amongst technical staff that are responsible for doing some of the making of the sausage, if you like, if I stick with the metaphor, that we all enjoy eating. Let me stop there and over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much. And Daniela, if you want to add some words, you have 5 minutes, please.
Sorry. No, thank you. No, I would like also to make some comments about that sustainability. Very interesting, Sally, presentation that like how countries, many countries don't consider today the DSAs in the budget planning and the fiscal. And this is crucial, but what we also think that is important is to empower countries to do that sustainability analysis. And then in this way, they can also, they will be in a better position also to discuss with the IMF, with the World Bank, with creditors like countries that are joining the common framework. From the side, and then in this case, I think many international institutions can provide the support to countries. The other important thing is from the perspective of the IMF and the World Bank that now they are revising the leaks DSA. That is also very good news, but would be really important that in this revision to access to include better way to access the impact of the climate-related shocks on developing countries' debt sustainability. Because this is crucial because, you know, if you underestimate, you have a greater forecast for growth than a better performance in terms of that sustainability. What could happen is that a natural shock can, you know, make the GDP decrease, and this makes all the analysis totally that is not realistic. Then I think this element is crucial, and also at the other, because there are two sides. These are, you need to consider the climate vulnerabilities in the DSA. It's not easy, but this is very important. In the other side of the coin, you need also to consider the investments on climate mitigation and adaptation is like a separate part of the budget, because these investments are crucial for increasing the resilience. So these need to be seen as assets that has a positive side on net liabilities, and not as investment that are increasing the fiscal deficit and then contributing to increase that sustainability. I think like the addressing these two sides of the coin of the climate challenge would be very important.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Very interesting. And last, if Sally wants to add some words to close this part of the sessions, and after Sally, we invite you to a health break of 5 minutes, Sally.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia, and to the other panelists. I think, I will support my fellow panelists, but I do think that Jafar raised an interesting question around transparency that I would love to answer. There was a paper released last year which actually looked into IMF and World Bank DSAs and the production of them. And it asked the question, in many cases, there's actually many people who challenge the findings of DSAs, in part because they say, oh, they underestimate the total amount of debt that a country can take on, with that the caveat that Daniela just raised, right? There are such strong investment needs, and many of those investment needs are in fact productive and could produce enough growth that would justify that investment, right? And in other cases, there is too much, right? You're hitting an upper limit of the solvency and liquidity aspects that Jafar raised in his presentation. So there really is this question around how do we get to a consensus around what is debt sustainability, right? These are very difficult concepts to agree on. And the push that at least this paper, it was done by Gail Hurley, made was to say, actually, especially the transparency challenge is more acute in low-income countries, and debt sustainability analyses done in low-income countries, which is also the place where, you know, there's a lot of pushback around what should be a productive debt level that allows both the investments that's needed but doesn't lead to a debt crisis. And there they said, okay, you may not necessarily disclose the actual data that's used, but you do need to disclose data sources and methodology so that an independent institution, if they wanted, could come in and replicate the analysis and question some of the underlying assumptions should they say, actually, we think this is not accurate, right? And that the whole question of why should we do this? This is, again, around building legitimacy and trust in these analyses. People need to understand them in order for people to really use them to say, actually, we should follow these guidelines, and we should understand that there is an upper limit of how much debt we can and what type of debt we can take on to make sure that we do avoid future debt crises. So that would be my response to that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, after these excellent presentations and contributions, I invite you to take a short break of 5 minutes sharp, please. See you together in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody.
Hi, Cecilia.
Please.
We hear
Hello,
you.
Cecilia.
Hello. Yes, in this part of the second session, we will hear about the SAIS experience. In this last part, we will hear SAIS Brazil and SAIS Argentina experiences in auditing public debt. The question to be answered are the following. You can see in the screen, what is your country's public debt compositions, trends, projections, and the DMO's strategies to ensure debt sustainability? And what is your SAIS mandate regarding public debt and its management? I encourage to speakers to be short and to respect the time, please. Our next speaker is Mr. Joaquín Ramalho de Albuquerque, auditor at the Federal Court of Accounts of Brazil. Welcome, Joaquín. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joaquim, and I work for Brazil's Supreme Audit Institution, TCU. Could you hear me? Sounding clear?
Yes, I hear you very well, and the other, I think, too.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation to learn from all of you and to share what we are doing here in Brazil. First, I will address TCU's mandate related to audit of public debt and the public debt management. Then I will walk you through TCU's audit of debt sustainability analysis, henceforth called DSA, and I will compare it to EMF sovereign risk and debt sustainability, henceforth called SRDIS. Finally, I will explore debt strategies developed by the Debt Management Office to reduce debt at sustainable levels. Next The TCU's mandate related to the audit. Please come back the slide, please. Thank you. The TCU mandate related to the audit of public debt and public debt management contains the following laws in the slides shared. The Constitution addresses public finance matters. The Fiscal Responsibility Law and the Fiscal Framework Law establish the debt indicator and its trajectory. And the Budget Guidelines Law sets a primary balance target compatible with debt sustainability. The Federal Constitution states that the Fiscal Responsibility Law will regulate debt sustainability and its indicators, compatibility levels between fiscal balances and debt trajectory, a convergence path for maintaining sustainable debt, and adjustment measures and sales plan. Next slide, please. One moment. Fiscal responsibility law aims to keep public debt at sustainable levels, prevent risks, and promote timely fiscal adjustment to ensure long-term solvency. The Budget Guidelines Law must establish annual primary balance target for the central government over a full year horizon, compatibility with a sustainable public debt horizon and over a 10-year horizon. The primary result, the primary balance, are deemed compatible with debt sustainability until the gross general government debt to GDP ratio stabilizes. The tolerance ranges for the annual primary balance target is plus or minus 0.25 of GDP. Now, I will present two distinct tools, DSA and the SRDS. In this slide and the next one, we have the DSA, conducted in December 2024. I want to highlight that in 2028, the GGD reaches 86.1% of GDP. Next slide, please. The SR uses the domestic concept of general government gross debt and incorporates the changes in monetary policy in 2024. Next slide, please. Now we have SRDS, conducted in March of 2024, that uses the International Monetary Fund's concept of GGD. Note that in 2028, the GGD is 95.1% as opposed to 86.1% in DSA. We have a difference of around 10% in the projections. This contrast is due to two differences in methodology. First, ISRDS GGD includes all treasury securities in the Central Bank of Brazil balance sheet. However, in the SA, the domestic definition of GGD includes only the stock of treasury securities used for monetary policy purposes, but excludes the rest of the government securities in the balance sheet of the authority, of the monetary authority. Isto é, that is, in SRDS, both repurchase agreement and treasury securities are included, but in the SA, only repurchase agreements are accounted for. Second difference, SRDS assumes the hypothesis that short-term interest rates are falling. However, later, when TCU projected the DSA, short-term interest rates were rising. Therefore, TCU had to adjust the interest rates to adapt the model to the most recent interest rate expectations. Note that SRDS is more robust than the SA, but despite that, the IMF classifies Brazil overall risk of sovereign stress as moderate. In the medium term, stress is elevated, mainly due to high gross financing needs, that is, the large share of debt maturing annually. However, despite these risks, Brazil benefits from a large domestic investor base, substantial central bank reserves, and predominantly local currency debt, reducing the probability of an immediate crisis. Next slide, please. Regarding the structure of Brazil's public debt, the majority of debt is issued in local currency, which significantly reduces foreign exchange risk. Only a small fraction of debt is in foreign currency. Next slide, please. With relation, there is a healthy mix. Banks, one moment, please. There is a healthy mix. Banks, private investors, and official creditors contributing to more diversified and resilient debt profile. Nearly all debt is under domestic law, which gives the government more flexibility during financial stress. Next slide, please. The share of short-term debt is notable, particularly in the 1 to 5 year range, which underscores Brazil's refinancing vulnerability. Next slide, please. This slide outlines the strategies developed by Brazil Debt Management Office to ensure debt remains sustainable. Key measures include the expansion and diversification of the investor base, fiscal consolidation, and the maintenance of a significant liquidity reserve, currently over 860 billion Brazilian reals. Additionally, 259 billion Brazilian reals have been mobilized from other budget resources to support debt servicing. Retail investment programs like Treasury Direct, Renda Plus, and Educa play a crucial role in engaging domestic savers. Importantly, the law that regulates relationship between central bank and national treasury allows, under strict conditions, the use of fiscal reserves to cover domestic public debt when severe liquidity constraints threaten her financing capacity. On the right-hand side of the slide, we see the diversified composition of debt holders, which includes banks, pension funds, governments, non-residents, insurance companies, and individual investors. This diversity is vital. It reduces refinancing risks and improves market resilience during shocks. Altogether, these strategies reflect a proactive approach to safeguarding Brazil's financial stability. That concludes this overview. That's all.
Thank you very much, Joaquin, for interesting experiences from TCU Brazil's side. And now, if you allow me, I'm happy to introduce SAIS Argentina's Vice Chair team. First, to open this presentation, we'll hear Mrs. Camila Carcaño, member of the technical team of the WGPD Vice Chair of SAIS Argentina, and Mrs. Sabrina Benedetto, technical support from the Vice Chair. Finally, Mrs. Eda Sanarello, advisor and technical leader from the Vice Presidency team for WGPD at SAIS Argentina. Please, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be part of this webinar and to share the current situation of Argentina's public debt. Next slide, please. Next. Again, please. So you can see Argentina's public debt has been on a strong upward trend since 2016. Nonetheless, at the end of 2024, a sharp drop in the debt to GDP ratio was observed because of a strong appreciation of the peso against the dollar. In the next slide, we can see the composition of gross debt by creditor. Next slide, please. Then debt by law. Next, please. The debt by law, the majority is in domestic law. This provides the issuing country with flexibility, giving the country more room for negotiation. Next slide, please. Debt by currency is heavily concentrated in two main denominations, the US dollars, representing 45%, and Argentina peso at 44%. Next, please. In relation to type of instrument, the majority of public debt is issued in public bonds. As regards to interest rates, the majority of debt is issued with fixed interest rates. Next, please. Then, debt maturities are heavily concentrated in the short term, especially in 2025, which creates significant financial pressure. This shows that the market has doubts about the solvency of Argentina's debt, which is made up 70% of bonds. It must be considered that 40% of capital payments projected for year 2025 correspond to public sector agencies, which lowers rollover risk. Next, please. So the 2025 yield curve appears inverted, reflecting a signal of distrust and deepening credit risk. Next, please. So the sustainability of public debt is a key concept in macroeconomic and fiscal analysis. Next, please. In general, the classic indicator is the debt to GDP ratio. Next, please. We have already seen some indicators, and now let's look some others. Next, please. The evolution of country risk and the interest to GDP ratio shows some improvement in 2024, but remains at high levels. This shows that there are still problems that make sustainable financing and growth difficult. Next, please. Next again. Then the same happened. No, back, please. The same happened with fiscal pressure from interest payments. Although interest payments stabilized, total debt remains very high. Next, please. Also, it's important to see how external debt compares to exports and reserves. These indicators are still weak, so the country, in this case Argentina, has less capacity to handle external shocks. Next. After each restructuring, the debt to GDP ratio goes down, but it raises again soon after. Next, please. In 2002, debt service fell to 0% because Argentina declared default, in 2001. After that, interest payment remained stable. Next, please. In the future, debt will remain high, but the agreement with IMF is followed. Payments could be better distributed and more manageable, helping to keep Argentina's finances in order. Next, please.
Okay, now I'm Sabrina, and we're now going to talk about Argentinian history of debt restructuring and why are we talking about this? Because this provides key insights on how the debt crises were managed over time. Next slide, please. Next. And next. Well, we're going to talk first about the 2004-05 debt restructuring process. After Argentina declared default on its public debt in 2001, the restructuring process initiated in these years, with an outstanding capital nearly $80 billion plus unpaid interests. In this big first attempt to normalize the debt situation, the official proposal focused on three key elements. First, reducing the number of instruments in circulation. Second, simplifying the applicable legal frameworks, so it was limited to only 3 foreign laws besides Argentinian law. And lastly, applying a significant capital cutback or haircut. This haircut wasn't the same for everyone and depended on which bond the investors held. The discount bondholders faced the biggest hit, as you can see in the chart, with 66% of reduction. An interesting fact is that the new bonds were issued retroactively from 2003. So all the interest that have accrued in that time was paid out in cash. And we can consider this as an incentive that was given to encourage people to accept the deal. In 2010, the offer was reopened, allowing more bondholders to join. This was a key step towards normalizing the country's debt structure after the default. Next, please. If we talk about the exchange results, we can see that was that was a significant high participation, over 66%, and also a big nominal reduction, as we said before, with an average nominal haircut of about 43.4%, and also an improvement of debt profile. This reduction in the debt burden is basically due to the discount bonds because these were the most accepted offers and took the biggest haircut. Next, please. So the deal not only cut the public debt stock that went down for 34%, but also increased the amount of debt in normal payment status that increased in 47%. Even the 2010 reopening process did not lower the total debt stock. It allowed more bondholders to join, and this reduced the amount still in default by over 60%. As a result, litigation risk was significantly reduced as new bonds required holders to waive legal claims. These two processes, the 2004-05 and 2010, regularized over 90% of defaulted debt and laid the groundwork for Argentinians' gradual return to capital markets. However, not everything was that nice. Not all bondholders accepted the voluntary offer and remained outside the restructuring process. This group was later known as the holdouts, and this led to subsequent legal, that was really costly, disputes. This issue kept unresolved until 2016, when the Argentinian government finally reached a settlement with most of them. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, 15 years later, after that restructuring process, we faced another restructuring in 2020. We had like these two, it was for this restructuring process, we covered both external and domestic debt. In the case of foreign legislation debt, the process involved over $66 billion in eligible securities, including near-term maturities such as 2021 and 2022 bonds, but also longer-dated instruments like discount and par bonds that were issued in the previous restructuring process. The main goal of this offer, the 2020, was sustainability without big cuts. So focused more on making payments more manageable over a longer period of time than in cutting the principal amount. New bonds maturities ranged from years 2030 to 2046. As a result, nearly the entire eligible stock was effectively restructured, providing a short-term debt relief to the country without applying a significant nominal haircut. In addition to extending maturities, the exchange lowered borrowing costs because the weighted average interest rate also was reduced. Next slide. This resulted in a positive reaction from markets. We can see that in the yield curve that improved substantially. The internal rate of return of new securities dropped significantly compared to the eligible ones. Thus, the lower yields for short-term bonds flattened the curve and reversed its slope. And this was a signal that market has increased their confidence in Argentinians' government debt. Next, please. What happened with the debt under local legislation? In this case, the debt was over $41 billion. And this involved a set of local instruments, including short-term bills, discount on par bonds, that were replaced with this new set of bonds featuring longer maturities between year 2030 and 2041. New bonds also included two bonds indexed to CER, which is a local inflation measure. So this was an offering. This offered an inflation protection for local bondholders. In this case, participation rate was also really high, 98%, resulting in a debt relief. And as before, the weighted average interest rate on domestic side also dropped, while the average life of these domestic bonds shortened by almost 5 years. Next slide. With the domestic swap, perceived risk was also significantly improved. Yields on the new bonds dropped considerably, flattening the curve and reversing the slope, as well as in the foreign loan case. So the maturity profile improved as average duration increased. However, interest rates in local bonds stayed a little bit higher than those under foreign law, reflecting market concerns over domestic economic, legal, and institutional environment. But overall, the transaction, the whole exchange in 2020, helped stabilize expectations and reduce pressure on local financing sources. That's it.
Thank you, Sabrina. Well, lastly, Mrs. Sanarello, could you?
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Cecilia, and thanks to Sabrina and Camila for the presentation. It is my role for this part of the session to share with you some aspects of SAI Argentina's mandate. Next slide, please. As you can see, this is referenced in Article 85 of the Argentina's National Constitution, which states that external audit of the national public sector is a responsibility of the legislative branch, whose opinion regarding the performance and overall situation of the public administration is based on the reports issued by our SAI in its role of technical advisor to the National Congress with functional autonomy. It's a wide mandate, and in general may include any entity that receives, spends, or manages public funds or funds with a public purpose. Next, please. To fulfill this mandate, our SAI is empowered to carry out all three types of audits: financial, performance, and compliance, detailed in SAI 100 and our SAI government external control standards. This regulation was the beginning of a deep regulatory reform with the purpose of aligning SAI Argentina's standards with international audit standards and core auditing principles. Next, please. The Financial Administration Law enables audit of debt-related programs and operations, including those financed by international financial institutions, and acts and contracts of economic relevance. Although public debt sustainability is not explicitly included, the legal framework provides sufficient authority to conduct such audits. Next. As part of these responsibilities, SAI Argentina has a management office for public debt audit, which includes a department for audit public debt operations and sustainability, whose primary responsibility is to plan, coordinate, supervise, and carry out audits and reviews of the public debt, its sustainability, and the related contingent risk. Any type of audit, compliance, financial, or performance can be applied to the matter, or a combination of them, according to what is established in our SAI's operational plan. Next, please. Back to you, Cecilia.
Yes. Thank you, Eda. First of all, I would like to ask you and the team to continue with our presentation with these two questions in order to take time to the translations. The first questions After this, we will ask to Mr. Joaquin Ramallo de Albuquerque to finish our session. Then we hear to Argentina teams first and to show their side experience in reports related to public debt sustainability.
Yes, first, Cecilia, we will discuss some tools applicable to debt sustainability. Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ada.
Okay, I need the slide that says tools or parameters used in debt sustainability. Before that. Tools, there. Well, now we will introduce some tools that we use as a site, we use to in our control work when auditing debt sustainability. This first one is an example that was used in the financial audit of fiscal year 2008. This kind of analysis of fiscal sustainability is central to debt sustainability and could be considered a core issue in the long term. The indicator is based on the primary surplus, that is budget balance before interest payments, and which one is required to stabilize the public debt to GDP ratio. The formula connects a real interest rate the government pays, the real growth rate of the economy, and the current debt to GDP level. So a certain primary surplus is needed to just stand still. But when the interest rate exceeds economic growth, the country must generate a higher primary surplus to prevent the debt ratio from rising. So this kind of tools allow sites to assess sustainability of the fiscal path under different scenarios without needing to simulate future debt services in detail. In the next slide, we can see the empirical application for this formula for the period from 1993 to 2008. And we can see that under different scenarios. We can see throughout most of the period that Argentina's actual fiscal outcome fell short of the threshold needed to stabilize the debt, but only between 2003 and 2007 that was this window where the primary surplus exceeded the sustainability requirement across all scenarios, thanks to strong economic growth and some fiscal adjustment related to the default, because this was between the default and before the exchange. In the rest of the period, the margin was tighter or even negative, highlighting the vulnerability of public finances outside of those boom years. The idea to show you this is to look that this kind of forward-looking sustainability analysis is useful to anticipate structural risks. And based on this, sites can make useful recommendations over this kind of analysis for DMOs to design more resilient fiscal policies in the face of potential economic or financial shocks. So it helps policymakers to see if they are heading for troubles. On the next slide, we can see this diagram, and this is based on DSA, IMF DSA, and even sites don't apply maybe the DSA analysis per se. We can address vulnerability analysis by assessing the critical variables that the IMF take into account in this analysis. So here you can be summarized, we summarize the critical variables identified in the DSA. And in the middle, we can see what we consider Argentinians, in the case of Argentina, which are the most important. First of all, fiscal variables. Why should be assessed? Because they are key. Why? Persistent deficits, that means constant borrowing needs, plus heavy debt burden, and in addition, relying on monetary financing, printing money, that is, and external borrowing just makes the country more exposed to shocks and complicates rollover prospects. This creates a kind of built-in fragility. Second, we consider macroeconomic fundamentals, such as GDP growth, current account balance, interest rates, and exchange rates. These fundamentally shape the country's ability to actually pay back its debt. And finally, Argentina's external restriction, balance of payments constraints. This plays a central role. Why? Chronic shortage of foreign currency is a key source of macroeconomic instability. Limited access to foreign currency limits imports and constrains economic growth, also fuels inflation and generates negative interest rates in real terms. Additionally, puts huge pressure on the exchange rate and drains reserves. All these directly impacts debt service in foreign currency. All these problems are amplified with cyclical crises, which are often triggered by external shocks, but also by internal policy issues. So together, these factors increase fiscal risk and market uncertainty, increase rollover risks, and ultimately heighten fiscal vulnerability, making debt sustainability a constant challenge. And that's why size should assess this kind of variables.
Thank you, Sabrina. Now Eda will comment the other part of the last part of our presentations. Eda?
Thank you, Cecilia. I will try to be very quick regarding on time and continue with the topics you referred previously. I will share with you some of the findings and recommendation of two of our reports. One referred to debt strategy and the other one, the audit of the IMF arrangement from year 2018. Next, please. Let us begin with the first report about Program 22. As you can see on screen, we used important source of criteria, for example, the Batul and UNCTAD principles. You can see it in detail later. Next, please. This audit found that the audit lacked a formal data strategy and no function related to it had been clearly defined in regulations. The audit equated the task with estimating borrowing needs within the framework of budget preparation. There was also a lack of systematic risk analysis and a comprehensive identification of contingent liabilities. Next, please. Recommendations included developing a debt strategy, of course, based on some practices, establishing broad guidelines, calculating sustainability and vulnerability indicators, and defining medium-term management objectives. A broader approach to contingent liabilities was also advised. Next. Another relevant report from our side concerns to 2018 agreement with the IMF. The sources of criteria, as you can see, were national constitution, financial administration law, regulations about proper advisory, transparency, and administrative procedures, and also considered sound practices such as Guide 50-50, Batul, UNCTAD principles, and IMF 2014 guidelines. Next, please. Key findings, including the absence of proper authorization and competence. Article 61 of the Financial Administration Law was breached, as no opinion was obtained from Central Bank on the operation's impact on the balance of payments. Core institutions like the Cabinet Office, Budget Office, and Internal Audit Unit were not involved. There was also a lack of several analyses like cost risk, repayment, and solvency, among others. Next. Moreover, the signing of the agreement with the IMF had an adverse impact on debt structure due to currency, amount, and terms, and increased the risk to debt sustainability. An additional fact is that in 2018, it accounted for 36% of that year's debt issuances, while in 2019, it represented 14% of the total direct debt. Next, please. And next one. Okay. Recommendations emphasized in involving relevant technical bodies in both the decision and legal review processes. It was also recommended full compliance with applicable regulations, especially for multilateral loans, and proposed establishing formal procedures involving the middle office, internal audit, and the Office of the Treasury Attorney for proper advice. Next, please. It was also recommended to document the rationale behind decisions, identify target creditors and markets, and ensure transparent management of funds. Finally, a recommendation also made in the previous report I will share with you was made again, to develop a strategy in line with sound practices for debt management and to ensure participation of units responsible for cost, risk, and sustainability analysis in specific processes. And next, please, and last. Thank you. Lastly, we were asked to comment with you on the impact of our recommendations on management of sustainable debt. It must be understood that our side does not have the authority to compel the auditee to comply with our recommendations. However, we have observed important changes that could be attributed to the impact of our audit reports. For example, law number 27612 on its strengthening of public debt sustainability determines that national budgets set a limit of foreign currency debt issuances under foreign law, and that operations with the IMF must be subject to a specific legislative approval. Progress has also been made in identifying contingent liabilities, particularly those related to litigation, an area of recurrent focus of our size accountability reports. This concludes my presentation. I sincerely thank you for your attention and thanks to everyone. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eda. Now we could invite to Mr. Joaquín Ramalho de Albuquerque to the floor. Please, Joaquín, if you can show your experience.
I have only 5 minutes. Then go direct to the slide 3, please. Next one, please. Next one, please. Okay. These slides presents our findings on the primary auctions of government securities, with a focus on compliance, transparency, competitiveness, and good practice by Brazil's Debt Management Office. Starting with compliance, we verified that applicable rules were followed. However, access to confidential data limited our ability to conduct a full assessment of dealer performance. This points to a broader need for greater transparency in auction procedures. In terms of transparency, we identified several weaknesses. Public data had regulatory inconsistencies, technical failures in application programming interfaces, and the auction result files, and lacked historical records of dealer performance. We recommend publishing data in open and machine-readable format as required by the Access to Information Law. On competitiveness, we found that the primary market is highly concentrated, especially for securities like LTN and NTNF. Additionally, the absence of formal metrics hinders competitiveness assessment. Our recommendation is to establish regular evaluation mechanism and format criteria for participation and performance. That said, we highlight positive initiative by the DMO, such as maintaining bid confidentiality and flexibility to respond to market dynamics. In conclusion, while rules are being followed, there are clear opportunities to enhance transparency, efficiency, and market trust. Our recommendation aims to strengthen governance and promote a more competitive auction environment. Next slide, please. This slide provides a deeper look at the market concentration in Brazil's primary auction of government securities, and it reinforces a key concern. A small number of institutions dominate these auctions. The analysis uses parity curves shown on the right-hand side to illustrate the cumulative share of securities acquired by auction participants. For each security, we observe that just a few participants account for a majority of the acquisitions. This is particularly pronounced in securities like LTN, where the top 3 or 4 institutions often represent over 80% of the total volume. This pattern of high concentration suggests that competition is limited, which may reduce the efficiency and fairness of the auction process. Moreover, it increases systemic risk as market conditions may be overly influenced by the action of a few dominant players. These findings underscores the need for the government to adopt formal metrics to monitor auction competitiveness and promote broader market participation. Enhancing competitiveness not only improves pricing, but also strengthens confidence and resilience in public debt management. Next slide, please. Cecilia, I prefer you come back for the slide, please.
Okay, okay. Yes, it's okay. Did you finish, Joaquin, your presentation?
I would like to present one more.
Yes,
Four
please.
slides.
Yes, please. Please, we hear you. Go ahead. This is the last
I'd
one?
like to go to slide 4.
That's right.
I'm trying to use the time you give me.
We are very sorry. Very, very sorry.
Okay. Slide 4, please.
Can you say the title of your slide that you need, Joaquin?
Internal control system. Slide 4. This, exactly. This slide highlights the main weakness identified during our audit of internal controls and public debt risk management. First, go to the next, please, the conclusions. First, we noted the absence of a comprehensive risk treatment plan. While a responsible party and timeline were defined, the plan lacked detailed strategies and mitigation actions, falling short of ISO 31000 standard and the institution's own risk management manual. Second, we found that risk reporting has limited scope. Although some reports are produced, they are not disseminated across the organization. As a result, critical risk information remains siloed within specific units. Third, existing control are not fully mapped into the risk assessment framework. Some relevant controls are in place, but were not documented or considered, which weakens the reliability of risk evaluation. Fourth, the tools used for risk management present conflicting information, particularly inconsistent risk level across platforms. This undermines coordination and decision-making. Lastly, there is insufficient implementation of information security procedures. Current practices do not meet the standard set by Decree 7000 or 8045/2012, exposes the system to vulnerabilities. This decree regulates procedures for security, accreditation, and the handling of classified information. These findings underscore the need for improved governance, integration, and transparency in Brazil's public debt risk management process. I used the time you give to me, Cecilia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joaquin, for your patience. Well, now we are closing our meeting, and as we could appreciate it, these experiences are strong and helpful for our size. A key question is about how auditors could manage the tools to evaluate debt sustainability in a proper way. The complexity of the matter, lessons learned, and how to apply a solid prospective analysis are crucial in our size. That's all. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much, Joaquin, for understand our limits in time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.